What's up, guys? We are taking a look at all of the best commander cards in the color green from the upcoming set Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander, which comes out on February 14th, 2025. My name is Nathan, you're watching the Saudi Productions YouTube channel, and I've already made set review videos for white, blue, black, red. This is the last for the colored set reviews, and we will also take a look at artifacts and multicolored spells in a separate video as well, so make sure to check those out if you're curious about all of the best commander cards from Aetherdrift. And of course, if you enjoy this video, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more set reviews from me. And if you want to support me and my channel, you can check out my Patreon link down below where you can access all kinds of awesome perks. All right, with that out of the way, let's actually hop into the set review. Now, really quick off the bat, I'm actually excited to not see a super busted green card out of Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander, because it seems like every set green gets something absolutely super busted in Commander, and this set is more designed for standard, and so we are a little bit lower powered, but I think that there are still some gems in here that you might want to look at for your various niche decks. All right, the first card here is March of the World Ooze. 6-mana enchantment, creatures control have base power and toughness 6/6, and are oozes in addition to their other types. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you create a 3/3 creature token. Now, I would personally ignore the second half of this card. I don't really think that will happen almost at all, or at least that's not the reason why you play this card. You play this card as a generic power buff, which is actually quite rare in the game of Magic. Grass Unstoppable Juggernaut is one of the most popular ones because it is colorless, but it does cost 8 mana, makes your creatures into 5/3s, and of course the new Porcelain Gallery, which is one of the best effects, overrun effects we've seen in white recently, that says creatures you control have base power and toughness each equal to the number of creatures you control, which costs 6 mana. So March of the World Ooze, one of the first-ish cards we've seen with just a base that just sets base power and toughness for your creatures. There is a Thunderfoot Baloth as well, but that does require you to have your commander on board, and that is also 6 mana. So I think 6 mana is a decent going rate for this effect, and I really, really like this in any deck where you're playing small creatures. Naturally, one might think that this would fit into a Slime Against Humanity deck, where you're creating a bunch of 0/0 green oozes, and then of course the +1/+1 counters go onto those creatures, and naturally if you slam March of the World Ooze with a bunch of 0/0s on the battlefield, they will get buffed by essentially +6/+6 on top of whatever they have for counters already on them. So here's where we have to sort of do the math and say, okay, well, March of the World Ooze does not give our creatures evasion, it does not give trample, but at what point in the power buff curve am I willing to trade in the lack of evasion for more power? And I think that March of the World Ooze does a good job. I think if you were to look at, if you were in like a tokens deck, for example, if we were in like a Shroofiz Sproutsire deck, making a bunch of 1/1 Saplings with Shroofiz itself already has trample, which is nice, then these creatures are going to get essentially +5/+5. Now, +5/+5 for 6 mana, I think is a pretty competitive rate. I think I'd be happy to have that because it also makes them blockers. We would have to look into options like Zapandrel, Hunger Dominus, and also Kamal as well if we wanted to get repeatable combat buffs with evasion, but none of them give +5/+5, the exception being Zapandrel, but that's also 7 mana. So I think that if you were to sort of examine this card, assuming you're in a deck with a lot of 1/1 creatures, as giving your creatures +5/+5 and no trample, I am personally okay with the rate of spending 6 mana for that if we don't get the evasion with it. And of course, if you care about enchantments, if you're in some sort of Sithis deck where you have a bunch of little 1/1 Enchantress creatures, then March of the World Ooze gets even better if you can pair this with Enchantress synergies. And that takes us to Agonasaur Rex. This is a 5-mana 8/8 dinosaur with trample. Whoo! 8/8 trample for 5 mana. That's a big beefy boy that's very efficiently costed. It has cycling for 3. Whenever you cycle this card, put 2 1/1 counters up to 1 target creature or vehicle against trample and indestructible until end of turn, which is a nice little backup mode, but I think it's not quite on rate for what you would expect to be a targeted protection spell, which typically is about 1 mana, but you do get the card out of it, so I guess it's not too bad as a backup mode. But typically you're just going to be slamming this for its giant beefy body, probably in a dinosaur deck. And this actually brings me back to one of my favorite cards back when I started playing in 2014, playing at the high school lunch table with Terra Stomper, one of my favorite creatures. 6 mana 8/8 with trample, and it can't be countered. Now obviously in 2025 Magic, this is not up to snuff because now we have a 5 mana 8/8 with trample, although it can be countered, so blue mages, keep your mana open, I suppose. But Agonasaur Rex, just a great include for your dinosaur decks. And, you know, it's not quite as good as what we already have. Galta, Primal Hunger, one of the most popular dinosaurs that's out there, just absolutely murdering people with its giant 12/12 trample body, but it is a nice addition to the suite of dinosaur decks. You might want to consider this for your Pantlaza dinosaur deck, or maybe even Goreclaw. Imagine this being a 3-mana 8/8 trample. Now, it doesn't do anything on ETB. It doesn't really draw a card. You could potentially pair this up with like discard synergies, but that's not typically. Well, I guess green does make use of the graveyard, so maybe you can recur this with like an Eternal Witness or something like that. But I think that this is just a big stompy boy that goes in a big stompy deck, and if you can maybe draw a card off of this with like a Herald's Horn, if you're in like a dinosaur tribal, then that's, you know, gravy on top. That brings us to Oviya, Automech Artisan, 4-mana 1/2 legendary creature, human artificer. Each creature that's attacking one of your opponents has trample, and we can pay 1 and tap it. You may put a creature or vehicle card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put an artifact on the battlefield this way, put 2 1/1 counters on it. Now, this is basically just Elvish Piper in a different form, or you could even argue an upgraded Elvish Piper because it gives each creature that's attacking one of your opponents trample, which is pretty sweet. I honestly think that Elvish Piper and Oviya are both power crept by Kona, which is one of the new commanders, a pretty popular commander back from Duskmourn, that allows you to just slam permanents. It doesn't even care about creatures, just any permanent right onto the battlefield. But if you look up Elvish Piper on EDH, you can probably find a deck where this would go in. I think it's just the best for what it does at 3 mana. You could argue, honestly, that you'd rather run something like a Selvala Heart of the Wilds rather than an Elvish Piper type of effect, because I'd rather almost produce mana that I can use towards instants and sorceries in addition to my creatures, instead of just slamming them onto the battlefield. If you want to be cheating huge creatures into play, give this a look. It's a second version of Elvish Piper, and you'll know if you want this card. So I like this in, you know, your big Haymaker decks, Maelstrom Wanderer, for example, and also it's pretty decent in Galadriel as well. So imagine, you know, you have Galadriel on the battlefield, you tap Oviya to slam a giant creature on the battlefield, and Galadriel immediately adds 3 mana that you can just use for anything. So that's pretty sweet as well. But yeah, I guess if you're in a big Haymaker deck, take a look at Oviya. Next, we have Nissa, Worldsoul Speaker, 4-mana 3/3 Elf Druid. Landfall, whenever land you control enters, you get 2 energy. You may pay 8 energy rather than the mana cost for permanent spells you cast. So this is a pretty awesome setup piece and payoff all on one card. I was taking a look at comparables, and I think that Architect of the Untamed is probably the most similar card that we've gotten, although it is at 3 mana and it only adds 1 energy whenever landfall ETBs, but it's very similar because, again, you can pay that 8 energy to create a 6/6 beast artifact creature token, which is not as good as probably whatever permanent spells you can play from your hand. And in terms of rate, I just wanted to include like a decoction module just to give you an idea that generally when it comes to energy, I think that 1 energy is worth about 1 mana. If we take a look at, I believe the colorless option that a lot of people play is Gonti's Aether something. I forget the exact name, but I have it up on screen here. And so generally we are happy if we can get more than 1 energy for 1 mana, and I think that with Nissa Worldsoul Speaker, you're probably playing all of the fetches, anything that will allow you to play extra lands, and so I think it's going to be pretty easy to generate 8 energy off of Nissa and then immediately cash that in for a big spell. So you could sort of look at this almost like its own Elvish Piper type of effect for your energy decks. It turns out that there's not a lot of popular green energy commanders, but there is a specific energy build using Yark the Desecrated, because a lot of energy adders happen on ETB. And there's also the new Saheeli Radiant Creator, which Nissa actually is in that precon. So you could take a look at Saheeli if you're in an energy deck and or you are messing with artifacts. It might be good there, and especially if you're running all of the fetch lands, this card gets way better. Next up here, we have Thunderous Velocipede, 3-mana 5/5 artifact vehicle that does trample. Each other vehicle and creature control enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it if its mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3 additional 1/1 counters on it. So this is not as good as Tribute to the World Tree in my opinion. I'd much rather draw a card on a creature ETBing, but I look at it more similarly to an Arwen Weaver of Hope, where at minimum, you're probably going to be adding 1/1 counters. Generally with 1/1 counter decks, you want to be really low to the ground with creatures that that will either add counters when they enter, and then so once you get the counters on them, then you start to proliferate, and proliferate is where more of the payoffs lie within 1/1 counter decks. I actually look at this as a pretty solid artifact. It has crew 3 and it's going to be buffing your team, so that crew 3 is really only maybe like a crew 1 or crew 2 because everything's going to be buffed on your field. So it's a nice 5/5 body, not too bad, and I just look at this as a pretty decent setup piece. Obviously, if you have a hardened scales on the battlefield, this gets way better because you're going to be adding 2 1/1 counters, and honestly, I'd rather stack this and like Arwen on the battlefield so that every creature that you play is automatically huge, and can be further proliferated. So you might think that, oh, I'm going to recommend this for Atraxa decks. Well, I'm tired of recommending that. I'm tired of Atraxa being the number 1/1 counter decks. So you know what? Consider this for your Arwen deck. That's right, folks. Put this in your mono green Arwen deck and absolutely go to town. Also, it's interesting synergy with Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, because this mana cost appears to be more than 5, but it is discounted for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. So Hamza, again, going wide, the mana cost is big, so this will enter with 3 1/1 counters on it, and it will immediately enter as an 8/8 with commander damage. So that's pretty dangerous with Hamza, Guardian of Arashin. Next up here we have Regal Imperiosaur, 3 mana 5/4. Jeez Louise, green just is feasting on big baddies here. It is a dinosaur, and says other dinosaurs you control get +1/+1. Now, if this looks familiar, it's because it resembles Thundering Spineback, which shows the power creep. Thundering Spineback, fun fact, was originally released in 2017, so 8 years later, we get a 5/4 Lord effect for 3 mana instead of a 5/5 for 7. Well, Thundering Spineback can also create dinosaurs, but if you're creating a 3/3 for 6 mana, you are doing something wrong, my friend. And then the other one I have here is just to show you how busted elves are in comparison to every other tribe in green. I have up here Elvish Archdruid, which not only is a lord, now granted it's not a 5/4, but it is a giant mana dork for the same rate, which just shows how elves are just absolutely busted in this game. But anyway, Regal Imperiosaur, it's very cute for your dinosaur decks. You can maybe take a look at this again for Pantlaza, and I also really like the Lord effect in any sort of enrage type of deck. So Way to Train a Prodigy is a relatively new one. Way to Train a Prodigy deals with basically enrage triggers, and so if you are able to buff up your dinosaurs, they're more likely to survive self-inflicted damage. So it's just an interesting little synergy piece, perhaps in a Way to deck. Next up here we have Peema Trailblazer, 3 mana 3/3 Elephant Warrior. It has trample. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you get that many energy counters, and it has exhaust, which means we can activate the ability only once. Pay 6 energy, put 2 1/1 counters on this creature, then draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So very interesting little payoff there. I'm not sure if we can consistently get in for damage with a 3/3 trample in 2025 Commander, but I actually like this more for the payoff in an energy deck that is green than anything else. And it turns out that there's not that many effects in green that specifically say draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. There's a lot of cards that will say when you do combat damage, draw cards equal to the damage dealt this way, or draw cards equal to the power of target creature, thinking of Soul's Majesty when it comes to that effect. But we don't want to ever be targeting our creatures because that makes them an easy 2-for-1 removal opportunity for our opponents. So we always want to be just non-targeting with this effect, and of course the best of the best are Return of the Loudspeaker and Rishkar's Expertise. And beyond that, the options are pretty slim. So this is just a nice little interesting add for your green energy decks, and definitely a consideration in any sort of energy decks. So Atraxa, not 1/1 counter build, I might add, but perhaps in an energy shell using Atraxa's Praetor's Voice. And of course, Saheeli, which we already mentioned, is an energy commander as well in Teamer colors. Then we have our honorable mentions. So these are cards that didn't quite make the cut, but wanted to bring them up anyway in case you have a niche use for them. Tyrian World Tyrant, or perhaps Terrian World Tyrant, 5 mana, 9/7. Boy, is this just an insta-slam for your Ruxa Patient Professor decks, which specifically, I'll just read the part that matters here. You may have creatures you control with no abilities assign their combat damage as though they weren't blocked. So this is a 9/7 unblockable in Ruxa decks, which is pretty amazing, but I'm just not sure where you would use this anywhere else. Even in a Power Matters or Fling style of deck, maybe a Gerard, a Golgari Lichlord deck might make use of this, but 5 mana for a generic 9/7 is just too much to pay for a vanilla creature in 2025, but if you have a niche use for it, then consider that for your Fling or Ruxa decks. Then we have, let me see here, Point the Way, 1 mana enchantment, start your engines. If you have no speed, it starts at 1, it increases once on each of your turns whenever an opponent loses life, max speed is 4. We can pay 4 and sack the enchantment to search up X basic land cards, where X is your speed, and those cards go onto the battlefield tapped. So this is a very slow ramp spell, and I don't like the rate because we need at least 3 lands out of this enchantment for it to be worth it as baseline, because we can always just play Explosive Vegetations, and that has been power crept out of the format multiple times. So this is a very, very slow Explosive Vegetations, and the only reason why I'm bringing this up is because you could maybe consider it in an enchantment reanimator deck, something perhaps like an Onyxia Hand of Erebos, although I did make a deck tech for Onyxia, you can check that out as well. And this is way too slow for my particular build with Onyxia, but if you care about it just being a 1 mana enchantment that can maybe trigger your Enchantress synergies to draw a card and then maybe ramp later on, you could consider this in your ramp slot if you have a lot of Enchantress synergies. And then our next honorable mention here is Rampaging Aetherhood, 5 mana 4/4 with Trample and Ward 2. It is a Hydra, I might add. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get an amount of energy equal to this creature's power. Then you may pay 1 or more energy if you do put that many 1/1 counters on this creature. Now, note that it says at the beginning of your upkeep, which means that before, or I should say, the first turn you can attack with this, it will already be an 8/8, and then next turn after that, it will be a 16/16. So I would consider this not even in an energy shell. I think this could honestly just go into any Hydra deck because it's just going to be a giant growing threat if this thing sits on the board and is not immediately removed. And I will add too that this does have Ward 2, so this is a pain. This is a giant pain to remove for your opponents, and I think this thing is going to be getting in for a ridiculous amount of damage. I mean, it only takes 3 turns for it to get to, well, let's see, if it sits on board once, right? Or let's say you play it, then the turn goes around, it comes back. 1 turn later, it's an 8/8. 2 turns later, it's a 16/16. 3 turns later, it's a 32/32. Absolutely ridiculous. Definitely consider this for your Hydra decks. Next we have Earthrumbler, 5 mana 7/6 vehicle with Vigilance and Trample, and we can exile an artifact or creature card from your graveyard to basically crew this until end of turn. So this is a pretty decent rate. A 7/6 Vigilance Trample body for 5 mana is not super bad. So if you happen to be incidentally filling your graveyard, or if you're in some sort of mount or vehicle deck, maybe give Earthrumbler a look as just a big body to swing in that will trigger all of your vehicle synergies. Next, we have Rise from the Wreck, 3 mana sorcery. Now, I will say before I read this card, this is the weakest of the bunch and definitely is meant for limited, but for 3 mana, we can return up to 1 target creature card, up to 1 target mount card, up to 1 target vehicle card, and up to 1 target creature with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. So, if you happen to be running a Leatherback Baloth to crew your vehicles because it has 4 power and only costs 3 mana, maybe consider a Rise from the Wreck in your vehicle deck. But honestly, I just think this card is funny because you could possibly draw 4 cards for only 3 mana, but the odds of doing so are so monumentally low that it is a little bit laughable. But again, this is the perfect place for an honorable mention because it technically can do busted things, but you have to be in a very specific archetype in a very specific deck. So anyway, that's Rise from the Wreck, definitely designed for limited. Next we have Lumbering Worldwagon, 3 mana star 4. It is a vehicle. Its power is equal to the number of lands you control. Whenever this vehicle enters or attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So it ETBs, it grabs a land, it puts it on the battlefield tapped. Okay, that's pretty below rate for 3 mana. Now we say, okay, well, it has to be crewed for 4, which is in green is not a giant crew cost. Generically, if we were not in green and we didn't have big green stompy bodies to crew this thing, I'd say that's a pretty high crew cost, but in green, we can consider it sort of like a crew 2 in any other color. So the question becomes, okay, do I want to then attack with this thing and, waste, well, I guess waste, we're going to use 4 power on board to crew this thing to then ramp out another basic land card. So it sort of resembles like a Sword of the Animist, or it would be more similar to the other 3 mana artifact equipment with Living Weapon. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll have that on screen as well. That particular card does not get a land when it ETBs, but I think that if you're already running that 3 mana equipment and you're in green, maybe give this a look. But honestly, green just has such better ramp that normally you're probably not running that particular equipment, and green just is already so fast that Lumbering Worldwagon, I just don't know can even keep up with the other competition that is in the ramp slot. I mean, my assumption is that with Lumbering Worldwagon, you can probably only get an attack in once before it actually dies from somebody blocking it in combat. So, one could argue that, oh, well, this will just get you a basic every turn for the rest of the game. And I just don't think that's realistic because creatures are so big in 2025 Commander. I just don't think it'll survive. So that means that, okay, it's 3 mana where ETBs grabs a land, then you attack for 1, or you attack once, it grabs another basic, and then you have to wait for that land to untap. So it's just very slow. And I'm also critical in that if you're crewing this thing for 4 power, why would I not just play in Entish Restoration, for example, which says sack a land, search a library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on battlefield tap, then shuffle. But if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, instead we tutor out 3 basic land cards, put them on battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So at instant speed, we can ramp out 2 mana instead of having this very slow Lumbering Worldwagon. So I guess if you're in an artifact deck and you care about the fact that this thing is an artifact, or you have specific vehicle synergies you want to trigger, give this a look. But otherwise, I'd say this card is pretty slow otherwise. Next, we have Bestow Greatness. Now, who cares what this card even does? Look at this art, folks. Look at how cute this art is. My goodness, this is one of my favorite arts of all time, I think. It's just an adorable little corgi with cute little armor on and little spikes on his back. And I can't tell, the person in this art must be making the corgi gigantic. It does say target creature gets +4/+4 and gains trample until end of turn. So it must be she who is bestowing the greatness on this little dog. I'm not sure what the lore is here, but the dog clearly did something good, and he's getting rewarded for it. What a good little boy. Okay, next card here, Dredger's Insight, 2 mana enchantment. Whenever one or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard, you gain 1 life. When this enchantment enters, mill 4 cards. You may put an artifact, creature, or land card from among the mill cards into your hand. This is mentioned specifically for, again, Onyxia decks. Any deck that cares about enchantments, that wants to put enchantments into the graveyard. This card basically cantrips while filling your graveyard and gives you some instant life gain. All good stuff for mid-range shells, so give Dredger's Insight a look if you care about enchantments hitting the graveyard and or milling. And that takes us to our top 3 green cards from Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander, and if we could get a drum roll, please, we have March of the World Ooze, Nissa Worldsoul Speaker, and Thunderous Velocipede. March of the World Ooze, a welcome addition to the repertoire of green overrun effects. It does not give evasion, but sometimes the buffs are good enough where it doesn't even matter, and it has upside of whenever an opponent casts a spell, you make a 6/6 if it's not their turn. Nissa Worldsoul Speaker is both a question and an answer on one card, where it will give you just all the energy in the world that you could ask for, especially if you're running fetch lands, and can allow you to cheat out giant dumb things. Then we have Thunderous Velocipede, going to be a great addition to all of the +1/+1 counter decks out there that I think personally do need help because they're vulnerable to board wipes, but this will be another welcome addition that will just put 1/1 counters on things and make them absolutely massive. So that is my green set review for Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander. Again, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more, and if you want to see all of my other set review videos, those will be on screen now.